So now we're going to get into another step of debugging, which is understanding errors. This is important because sometimes our assertion statements won't be enough, and we'll have to be able to parse the errors that Python provides to us, which are often a little bit less readable. So in order to demonstrate this, we're going to go through some more example buggy functions, the first of which is print sums. That's right, no more palindromes. So let's take a look at the print sums function. Let's walk through what the intended behavior is before we talk about maybe identifying the bug. So it looks like from these trusty doc tests that print sums expects an integer, right? Print sums gets called in a number, and then it prints out that number, and it also returns something, which will be stored in F1. All right, and then we know that F1 must be a function because it gets called on its own integer, prints something out, and then its return value is stored in F2. So F1 also returns a function because F2 is then called on an integer and its return value is stored. And at each point, something's printed out. So I'm going to break down what's happening here. Print sums is a function that both returns a function and prints out whatever was input to it. So in this case, print sums took in 1, it outputs 1, and then it stores a new function, it returns it, and that will be stored in F1 in this case. Then when the function that print sums returned is called on a new integer, that function will print out the sum of the integers so far. So in this case, 3 plus 1 is 4, so 4 is printed out, and this function will return another function. If that function is called in another integer, it'll print out the sum so far. So in this case, 5 plus 3 plus 1, it'll print out 9. It's the sum of all of the integers that have been passed in to each of these successive functions. All right, so we have the intended behavior print sums. It's a little bit tricky, but it's just an example of a function that returns a new function, which returns a new function, and so on. And all these functions taken are integers, and they successfully will print out the sum so far of all of the integers fed into them. Cool. So now let's see whether our trusty doc tests actually pass. So python 3-m doc test and then our file name. Ooh. All right, so we're getting an error in this line of the doc test. None type object is not callable. Okay, so if we look at our code, what does this mean? This means that, well, there's a call happening in this line, and the call is happening on an object that isn't a function. In fact, we're trying to call a none type object. So first we notice that the only function call here is in this part of the line, right? F3 equals F2 of 5. This is just an assignment statement, not a function call, but this is a function call, all right? And then what is the variable that we're trying to call? It's F2. So what that means in this case is that F2, we expect it to be a function, but actually it's a none, right? F2 points to none. All right, so basically we've broken down what this error means, and this is a very common error. In this case, it means that somewhere in here, our function isn't behaving as expected. All right, given these clues, let's try walking through print sums and figuring out what's going on. So print sums, the first thing it does is print the number that was input into it. All right, that makes sense. That's what we expect. Then it defines a new function and returns that new function. So far, so good. Print sums is behaving exactly as we thought it should, right? Takes in an integer, prints out the integer, returns a function, which is what we expected. F1 should point to a function. Okay, let's see what happens next. That function takes in an integer. In this case, that would be 3. And then it calls print sums on n plus k. Great. I want to give you guys a minute. By a minute, I mean 5 seconds to pause right here and try to identify what the error might be. So pause right here. I'll do the 5-second thing. Okay, So the reason I paused right there is because I was hoping that from what we walked through so far, the error might become evident. So we see right here, next sum was called on k. We established that next sum is what f1 points to, right? Because f1 points to the return value of print sums. Print sums of 1 would return a next sum function. And next sum, as we see here, doesn't have a return value. So pointing f2 to the return value of f1 means that f2 is going to point to nothing because next sum doesn't have a return statement. And this is really key. You'll probably run into this in future assignments as you're debugging your own code, but always remember, no matter how many function calls or any other logic that's happening in a function, without a return statement, that function is not returning anything. And so, before we dive into anything else, let's just try fixing this by adding a return statement right here. And so in this case, let's see what happens now. Awesome, my tests are passing. I encourage you to try walking through this function on your own and trying to reason about why this works. But for our purposes, we've resolved the error, and we can move on to a new example.